He thought it would be another meeting, another handshake, another headline. But when Trump sat across from Traore, the youngest African president didn't talk politics. He told his story. And by the time he finished, Trump didn't have a single word left. The message was short. No official stamp, no political jargon. Just one sentence, relayed through quiet back channels. Trump requests a private meeting with President Ibrahim Traoré. No press, no agenda. Traoré read it once, then again. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He just stared at the paper, like it was a test, not an invitation. His advisors whispered over maps and schedules, weighing risk against reward. Some urged him to decline. Others warned him not to appear defiant. But Traoré, he said nothing for hours. Finally, standing alone near a window that overlooked the morning dust of Ouagadougou, he muttered just one word: accept. 3 days later, the sky above New York was gray and heavy as a black SUV pulled up to a private entrance at a tower most people never knew existed. No media, no motorcade, just silence. Trump's team had prepared everything. A polished boardroom, 2 flags standing stiff at opposite corners, a carafe of untouched water. The kind of setting designed to control the narrative. Traoré walked in without ceremony. No suit, just his military jacket. Dust from his boots still clinging to the hem. He sat down quietly, not looking at the table, but straight ahead. The door opened minutes later. Trump entered with his usual swagger, confident. Sharp-eyed, the room adjusting to him like it always did. But this time, something didn't shift. He extended his hand, and Traoré rose. They shook. Brief, firm, but not friendly. Just 2 men checking the weight of each other's presence. Trump smiled. "I've been following you. Youngest president. On the continent, huh? Impressive." Traoré's face didn't move. Trump continued, leaning back casually. "I respect that. Real leadership. I like strong people. People who get things done." Still, Traoré said nothing. His eyes didn't blink. His posture was still unreadable. And then, softly, without raising his voice, he asked one question. "Do you know what it's like when your childhood ends with a gunshot?" Trump froze. He looked at Traoré, waiting for a punchline, but none came. Just silence. The former president adjusted his sleeve, clearing his throat. "Look, I've dealt with rough people. War, diplomacy." But Traoré gently interrupted, his voice still calm. "I was 11 years old when soldiers came to our home." The words landed like a quiet drumbeat. Slow, controlled, heavy. They weren't ours. They didn't knock. They didn't care who we were. They burned the roof before we could scream. Trump blinked, his usual rhythm of dominance gone. "My brother was 15. He covered my sister with his body. She survived. He didn't." There was no anger in Traoré's voice, only stillness, only memory. "That was the day I stopped being a boy. Not because I wanted to, but because the world told me I no longer had time to be one." Trump leaned forward, no longer speaking, no longer smiling. He had expected a conversation. He was getting a confession, and it wasn't over yet. Trump's fingers tapped the table, softly at first, a nervous rhythm, a habit he often used to assert control in rooms where silence made him uncomfortable. But Traoré wasn't trying to make him uncomfortable. He wasn't trying anything. He was simply telling the truth. "My mother didn't cry that day," Traoré said, eyes distant. "She didn't scream. She just gathered what was left of us and walked barefoot through 15 kilometers of smoke and silence." Trump shifted. That's awful," he muttered. It sounded mechanical, empty, as if he had nothing else to say. Traoré finally looked at him directly. "Do you know what that does to a child's mind? To survive something before you even understand what it means. To live, Trump exhaled slowly, not because he wanted to, but because something inside him had started to feel heavy, like the weight of words spoken in a language no policy could translate. You see, Mr. Trump, Traore continued, you came into power through walls of applause. I came into power through fields of graves. The silence cracked. Trump glanced at the water on the table, but didn't touch it. He looked around the room as if searching for something to hold on to. But there was nothing. I wasn't raised on speeches or slogans, Traore said. I was raised by mothers who buried their children in silence and still had to walk home and cook for the living. Trump rubbed the edge of his cuff. Still, no reply. Traore leaned back slightly. You asked for this meeting, he said. Not to debate, not to negotiate. You wanted to understand what I'm doing, why I'm doing it. He paused. So, I'm telling you, there was no anger in his tone, no ego, just clarity. I didn't rise to power because I was hungry for it. I rose because too many people were dying under leaders who ate while their children starved. Because someone needed to stand in the fire instead of watching it from behind tinted glass. Trump's face was no longer the mask of a dealmaker. He looked older now, quieter. I didn't come here to impress you, Traore said. And I don't need your approval, but I want you to know, I remember every name I've lost. I carry them with me, like blood in my veins, like breath in my lungs. He stopped. The air in the room had thickened. Every word had sunk into the marble, into the chairs, into the silence that now wrapped around Trump like a coat he couldn't take off. So when I speak, Traore whispered, I don't speak for politics. I speak for graves that never got tombstones, for voices that died before they were allowed to scream. Trump lowered his gaze. For the first time since he entered the room, he looked like a man without a script. Trump cleared his throat, not because he had something to say, but because silence had stretched so long it had started to press against his chest. He finally spoke, voice lower than before. I didn't know you went through all that. Traore looked at him, not with blame, not with anger, just with something more dangerous. Honesty. You weren't meant to know, he said quietly. Men like you aren't shown the broken parts of the world. You're handed the polished version, clean, profitable, distant. Trump didn't respond. But now you've seen one scar, Traore said. Just one. And already, the room feels different, doesn't it? Trump nodded slowly. No words. Just that small, stiff movement. Tell me, Traore continued. When was the last time someone in power told you something that didn't benefit them? Trump blinked. When was the last time someone looked at you and said, you don't understand, and meant it? Trump's mouth opened slightly, then closed. It was the kind of question that didn't need an answer. Not out loud, anyway. Traore leaned back again. His hands rested in his lap, calm, steady, but his presence still filled the room like thunder that never struck but promised to. The world doesn't need more men trying to be remembered, he said. It needs men willing to be forgotten. If it means someone else can survive. Trump stared at him. For war. Once, he wasn't thinking about headlines or polls. He was just listening. In my country, Traore said, I don't give speeches to win votes. I speak so that the children with no shoes will know they are seen. I speak so that the mothers who bury their babies will know someone is still breathing. For them, he paused again. You see a man with a uniform. You see power. But he wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about what Traore had said before he left. About grief, about power, about mothers who buried their children without even a name on a stone. And for a moment, just a moment, he saw something terrifying. A world that didn't need men like him. He turned back toward the table. The chair Traore had sat in still held the shape of his presence. And Trump realized something he hadn't felt in years. He had been the student in that room, not the teacher. His aide reappeared quietly. "Sir, your statement for the press is ready. Just a brief note about the meeting." Trump didn't answer right away. He walked to the table, picked up the folder, then closed it. "No statement," he said. The aide hesitated. "None. At all?" Trump stared at the closed door, where Traore had walked out just minutes before. No one would believe it anyway. And with that, he walked past the cameras, past the lights, his face unreadable, his mind full of names he had never known, and the quiet voice of a young man who'd already buried too many. That night, the press tried to guess what had happened. Photos leaked grainy, distant of Trump's car, parked in front of a private Manhattan complex. But there were no official updates, no tweets, no sound bites, just silence. And that silence made them nervous. Across cable networks, experts speculated. Was this a power move? Did Trump offer him something? Did Traore walk out? But no one knew. Because the real story wasn't one made for headlines. It wasn't loud enough for television. It wasn't profitable enough for politics. It was just one man, sitting in the dark of his hotel suite that night, staring at the floor and replaying words not designed to win votes, but to expose a wound. Trump didn't touch his food. He didn't turn on the TV. He just sat thinking. And somewhere, thousands of miles away in a dimly lit office in Ouagadougou, Traore sat too, alone. No advisors. Just a single photograph on his desk, one that no one else had ever seen. It showed a boy, his brother, 15 years old, standing tall, barefoot, next to a small, sick girl clinging to his side. Traore reached for the photo. He stared at it not with sorrow, but with duty. "I spoke for you today," he whispered. No one responded, but the silence felt like a nod. Across the ocean, Trump finally stood. He walked to a small drawer beside his desk and pulled out a letter one he'd received long before his presidency. It was from a gold star mother. The ink had faded, but the line at the end still stood out. "Real leaders don't speak louder than pain. They listen harder than pride." Trump sat back down. That line and Traore's final words now felt like they were written by the same hand. The next morning, Trump made a call, not to the press, not to a network, not even to his political allies. He called someone at the State Department, quietly, privately. "I want to know more about what's going on in Burkina Faso," he said. "Not the headlines, the real stories, the villages, the people." The voice on the other end stammered, surprised. "Of course, sir, but may I ask why?" Trump looked out the window. And this time, instead of talking, he listened. Because for the first time in a long time, the world had spoken to him without begging for applause. And he had finally understood. Leadership isn't about being heard. It's about having the courage to hear. 3 days passed. No statements, no interviews, no retaliation tweets, just silence. The world kept spinning. News cycles moved on. Commentators speculated, then forgot. But in a back room inside an old government building in D.C., Trump sat in a closed-door meeting with career diplomats. Some hadn't seen him since he left office. Others had never seen him sit so still. He wasn't interrupting, wasn't mocking. He was listening. Someone presented a file, a recent intelligence report about rural displacements in West Africa. A voice across the table began to speak of resource competition, militia movements, arms deals. Trump raised a hand. "No," he said, quiet but firm. "Tell me about the kids. How many schools have closed? How many families have left their homes? Do we know their names?" The room went silent. One diplomat adjusted his glasses. "We don't usually collect names, sir." Trump frowned. "Maybe we should." No one knew what had triggered this shift. They didn't know about the marble table, or the boy in the story, or the whisper that broke the strongest voice in every room. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, Traore stood before a crowd, not of politicians, but of children. Dust swirled around a makeshift schoolyard, where desks were mismatched and chalkboards were cracked. And yet, the kids smiled, because their president was here. Not in a suit, not with bodyguards. Just here. He knelt beside a boy who looked no older than he once was. "What do you want to be?" Traore asked. The boy's eyes lit up. "A soldier." Traore paused, then smiled gently. "Be more than that," he said. "Be the kind of man who knows when not to fight." And as he stood, the wind picked up a dusty wind that carried the sound of children laughing, learning, living. It was the kind of sound no headline could capture. That night, a photo was released. No press conference, no caption. Just an image of Trump standing in a private garden outside his estate, holding a small, printed photo in his hands. It was grainy, old. But if you look closely, you'd see a young boy, holding a sick little girl. No shoes, no flag, no victory, just love and loss. The image wasn't from his life, but it now lived in his memory. Because even the loudest men can be changed by the quietest truths. And sometimes, the most powerful meeting in the world leaves no sound behind, only silence, and the choice of who you decide to become after it. The image never reached the news. No headlines, no captions, just a single grainy photo, quietly printed and kept. But sometimes, the loudest revolutions happen where no camera dares to follow. In the weeks that followed, something shifted. Not globally, not visibly, but in small places, quiet places. An anonymous fund was donated to a remote medical clinic in Burkina Faso, enough to buy generators, textbooks, even new shoes for children who had never owned a pair. No one claimed it. No press release followed. But inside the envelope was a handwritten note. For those who walk barefoot and still carry the world. In Washington, a former president turned down 3 major interviews, not because he was too busy, but because he no longer felt the need to talk. He had said enough in his life, built towers, built myths, built walls, but he'd never truly listened, not until that day. Now, he walked his corridors more slowly, spoke to his staff more gently, not changed completely, but no longer pretending that power had made him immune to truth. And thousands of miles away, Traore stood beneath a fig tree near the same field where he once buried a brother and a childhood. But this time, he wasn't alone. Children laughed around him, some chasing wind, others writing letters they'd never send. Hope was no longer a visitor. One of his aides approached. "There's a request from Paris," he said. "They want a televised address. An interview." Traore looked out at the fields. "No," he said calmly. "I've already given my most important speech." The aide looked confused. "When?" Traore smiled faintly. "To a man who once believed the world owed him an audience." He didn't say Trump's name. He didn't need to. Because some conversations were never meant to be remembered for who was in the room, but for what was left after it ended. And in that silent, sacred space, something real had been born. Not policy, not agreement, but a quiet, invisible bridge. One built from grief, memory, and a voice brave enough to speak where others stayed silent. Because in the end, the most powerful thing one leader can say to another is nothing, just truth. If that moment between Trump and Traore moved you even half as much as it moved us while telling it, then hit that like button, subscribe for more stories the world isn't ready to hear, and tell us in the comments, if you had just 1 minute to speak truth to power, what would you say? We're listening. The strongest words ever spoken are the ones that leave a powerful man with nothing left to say.